Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be going over the Ruy Lopez beginning with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 begins the Ruy Lopez, and in this video we're not going to be going over anything like the Berlin beginning with knight to f6, and we're not going to be going over any of the marshals or anti-marshals, which I've already done videos on and covered those variations pretty much to death. Instead, we're going to be going over some of these old main lines, and the line that we're going to be going over today specifically is called the Breyer variation. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So all of these old main lines are going to kind of begin the same way. We're going to start with a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop to e7, rook e1, b5, bishop to b3, and then instead of playing castles and threatening the marshal, which I know this is what everybody does today, at the top levels, at the club levels, at every levels. And if you play the Ruy Lopez, 90% of your preparation should just be on this. We're going to have black play the old main line beginning with pawn to d6, and then we're going to go into the sort of main position of the old main line beginning with pawn to c3, castles h3. So here there are a ton of possibilities, and I'm going to have to make a ton of videos on all of these possibilities, and this is part of what I was dreading. Is number one, you don't face this that much anymore these days because the Marshall and the Berlin are just equalizing, and they're equalizing relatively easily. So nobody's really doing this stuff anymore. This used to be what everybody would do back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, even early 2000s. This was what everybody did, was they went into this kind of stuff. And there is so much theory here. There are so many twists and turns, so many different ways that black can go. Just for example, even in this position, this is a huge stemming off point. The subject of this video is, of course, the Breyer variation. But it is also possible to play knight to a5, which is probably going to be like 2 or 3 videos because there's a bunch of different main variations just from this move. And there's a bunch of different sidelines within each of those variations. It's going to be very difficult to break this down into anything less than 2 or 3 videos. 2 would be a miracle, actually, probably 3. But we're going to have knight a5 as a move, bishop to b7 as a move, knight to d7 is a move, h6 is a move, and then you start running into minor options like bishop e6 is a move, and it's reasonable, and rook e8 is a move. One of the reasons why there's so many reasonable moves in this type of position, just to begin with, is that white very clearly does have some sort of slight edge here. It's very obvious that even after, like, say, the Breyer, like, let's say have something like knight b8, it's very obvious that after something like d4, white is clearly a little bit better. White has the pawn duo in the middle of the board. White has a little bit more space. White has the slightly cleaner pawn structure. And that's going to be true no matter how black deploys his pieces, which gives black this really wide range of how he can choose to deploy his pieces. He can set his pieces up like this, where he chooses to put his pieces on sort of the most ideal squares for the structure. He can set his pieces up in different ways. He can play knight a5 just to get his knight out of the way as quickly as possible, so he can play c5. He can set up his bishop on the long diagonal. He can set up his bishop on this diagonal. It's really a wide open field on how black can deploy his pieces, and the same is true for white. White can meet all of these deployments in 5, 6, 7, 8 different ways that are all equally reasonable as well, which just makes this a really difficult position to prepare. It makes it an even harder position to do a video on because I know that I'm going to get a dozen comments where people are going to be like, that's not the main line, this is the main line, why didn't you cover this, why didn't you cover that? And in this case, everyone's probably going to be right. So it's just hard to cover everything. But after d4, and we'll say knight to d7, which is kind of the idea behind the Breyer, is to redeploy your pieces in this fashion. Bring your knight to the d7 square, open up the diagonal for your bishop with bishop to b7, open up that c5 square potentially for the knight, defend the e5 square with your knight. White's going to play knight on b to d2. Now, again, there's alternatives here. We could play c4. We could play knight h4. I'm not going to be covering those moves. They're both possible. But we're going to have knight on b to d2. And now black is going to go about his strategy of playing rook e8, bishop b7. So we have bishop b7 putting pressure on e4. And then the main move here is bishop to c2. The idea of which is to protect the e4 square to free up the knight so we can play knight f1 to g3. So here we're going to have black play this main line of rook to e8, and now the main line here is knight f1. Now the old main line, well, not, I mean, the one of the first, I shouldn't even say one of the first attempts, a line here is to play pawn to b4. And this was played by Bobby Fischer against Fischer-Spassky back in 1972 in the World Championship match. So we have to take this seriously, and we have to look at it because this is something that we do kind of need to understand about the position. This move makes a lot of sense. b4 is aimed against c5. It starts initiating queenside play. We're locking down this b5 pawn. We're preparing to play pawn to a4 so we can break open that queenside. So the move on its own merits just makes a ton of logical sense. Now, the Fischer versus Spassky game continued with the move bishop to f8. It is of note that the move pawn to a5 supposedly just leads to advantage white. For example, a5, knight to b3, ab4, cb4, rook to b8, knight a5, c6. And then we would have something like knight b7, rook b7. Bishop to b3 was played in Sutin versus Trignov back in 1966, and this was in fact major advantage white. So instead of a5, we're going to have this move bishop to f8. And here we're going to have this move pawn to a4. This was Fischer's idea. And here there's a whole bunch of different moves that are possible. Most of them just lead to advantage white. So for example, a5, b takes a5. We're going to have rook takes a5, rook b1 should be advantage white. Another possibility after a4 is pawn to c5, takes. This is also slight edge white. This is played in Balashov versus Podgaz. Another possibility is we could have pawn to d5 after knight takes e5. This position is also supposed to be advantage white. Knight takes e5, d takes e5, f4 takes on f3. Then d takes f3, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop d6, bishop to f4 was played in Washkov versus Kolmov, played back in 1973. This was advantage white as well. So pretty much that's going to leave this possibility of knight to b6, which is what was actually played in the Fischer versus Spassky game. And that game continued with pawn to a5, knight to d7, bishop to b2. And again, other moves are possible here. Rook b1 was also possible. That's supposed to lead to equality. Just rook b1, d5 is supposed to be equal. But anyway, so bishop b2 was played in the Fischer versus Spassky game, and in that game we had queen to b8, and then Fischer ended up getting an advantage in that game. He could have possibly gotten an advantage here with c4 was another possibility. In the game, he continued with rook b1, and white did eventually get an advantage, and white did eventually win. Now, it's interesting to note that nobody really plays this line with b4 anymore. And maybe the reason is because not long after this game, like about 3 years after this game in 1975, the move rook to b8 was played. And this was played in Brown versus Karpov, played in actually 1976. It's played in Amsterdam in 1976, which continued rook b8, rook b1, bishop to a8, bishop to a1, pawn to g6, pawn to c4. We had b takes c4 in that game, takes on e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d takes c5, bishop to c3, bishop c6, queen e2, bishop d5, knight c4, c5, b takes c5, and then rook c8 was apparently pretty good for black. Black was at least equal here, and Karpov ended up getting an advantage, and Karpov ended up going on to win. This was Brown versus Karpov, played in Amsterdam back in 1976. So this is probably the reason that people don't tend to follow this, is because there is this possibility of rook to b8 in this position. And if we go back, even Fischer himself in his return match against Boris Spassky preferred the move knight to f1, which on a logical level just makes more sense, actually. We play knight f1 because we are currently overprotecting e4. They haven't had time to play bishop f8 yet, so they're not putting that additional pressure on the e4 square. We will have time to transfer our knight to g3. Once we transfer our knight to g3, then we can undergo operations on the queen side, beginning with b4, a4, etc. So knight f1, just because I know that this is going to be really common on the lower levels. And again, I know there's a lot of lines that I'm not covering here for both sides, even up to this point. One line I will cover, just because I know it's going to get played, is c5. People will play this. I know that people play this on the lower levels. For whatever reason, when people put their knight on d7, they think that c5 just makes the most logical sense in the world. d5 should just be advantage white. This is the remedy, typically, to a move like c5, especially when they have their bishop fianchettoed. It makes this bishop and this knight just look a little ridiculous. And the queen side over here is sort of exceptionally weak when they've already advanced all of their pawns. So this was played in Bronstein versus Legal, played in Tallinn in 1975. That game continued with pawn to c4, bishop e3, queen c7, and then Bronstein continued with g4. And then after knight to c5, we had knight to g3, we had bishop f8, queen to d2, a5, b3, rook eb8, b4, takes on b4, takes on b4, knight to a4, and then we have bishop g5 got played in the Bronstein game, and Bronstein did go on to win. I will just note, just for purposes of preparation, g5 is an improvement here. So you could just play g5, knight d7, and then something like knight to h2 should just be advantage white, and this is how I would play it. But just all these positions with c5 and d5 are going to be some sort of advantage white. So when they play c5, just remember, push past, just play d5. And this is even just good advice if they play c5 even on the next move. So, for example, knight f1, bishop f8, we can bring our knight to g3. And again, the same remedy. If c5, we should just play d5. And these positions should just be considered slight edge white as well, and basically for the same reason. And we have a couple of games here. We have Tal versus Gligoric, and we have Kasparov versus Piquet, but just keep in mind these positions are slight edge white because I'm just not going to be covering all the intricacies of each of these individual games in this particular video. Again, because if I cover everything, the video is going to be, 36 hours long. So bishop f8, we're going to have knight to g3, and then we're going to have pawn to g6. This is also kind of, I think, the move that everybody plays here. They want to keep that knight out of the f5 square. Other lines and other variations that black can play leave open the possibility of this knight on g3 coming to f5. So I think g6 is just going to be one of your more common tries. And now the move that I kind of liked, the move that I was attached to, was the move that Fischer played. He played this move bishop to g5, h6, and then bishop back to d2. So this is the move that I thought was the way to go. This was what Fischer played in his return match against Fischer-Spassky. And again, there's other lines that I'm not covering here. After g6, a4 is certainly possible. It's another direction that white can go. But bishop g5, h6, bishop g2, bishop d2. This was what Fischer played against Spassky in 1992 in their return match. That game continued bishop to g7. We have pawn to a4, pawn to c5, d5. Again, c5, the remedy is d5, and that's almost a pretty universal thing here. We're going to have pawn to c4, and then we have pawn to b4. And this was really cool, because after pawn to b4 and then knight h7, Fischer played bishop to e3, h5, queen to d2. And this position should already be considered decisive advantage white. And it's just because there's strategically the game is pretty much over. White has covered the c5 square, so there's not going to be a knight to c5 here. White has also blunted this bishop because he's planted the pawns on d5 and e4, so the bishop is essentially useless. And eventually white is just going to build up pressure on this a file and capture on b5. And he does it in a pretty cool way, because we don't always get to do this in chess. It's a rare type of maneuver that we get to pull off. It's something called Alekhine's gun. But it continues with rook to f8, rook a3, knight on d to f6, rook e to a1, queen d7, rook on 1 to a2, rook on f to c8, queen to c1, bishop f8, queen a1. So the tripling of the file with the queen in back is referred to as Alekhine's gun. And Fischer did this, and his intention was to eventually take on b5. And this position is clearly advantage white. The only reason white gets away with it is because the center is completely stable, and there was just absolutely no way black was ever going to be able to do anything on the king side. You can't really play g5 in this position when things are hanging, and of course white can still readily transfer his pieces back over to the king side if black tries to do anything that even remotely looks scary. So all Spassky can really do is just kind of hang out behind these three ranks and wait for Fischer to make some sort of breakthrough. And this position should just be advantage white, and I will just kind of show the rest of this game. The game continued queen to e8, knight back to f1, bishop to e7, knight d2, transferring that knight back over to the queen side, king g7, knight b1, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, f5, bishop to c2, bishop takes d5. So Spassky just tried to collapse the center to get something out of the position. We have ab5, and then rook a7, taking over the 7th rank, king to f6, knight back to d2, rook takes a7, rook takes a7, rook a8, and then g4 breaking through against the king. So we see this gorgeous kind of play going on both sides of the board, breaking open these squares, breaking open that square, rook on the 7th rank, queen ready to come into the game as well. So we have h takes g4, h takes g4, rook takes a7, queen takes a7, f4, bishop takes f4, e takes f4, knight to h4, bishop f7, queen d4 check, king e6, knight f5, bishop to f8, queen takes f4, king to d7, knight to d4, queen e1 check, king g2, bishop to d5 check, bishop e4, bishop takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop e7, knight takes b5, triple attacking the d6 square, and as long as the white king is safe, the game is essentially over, and it is. So we have knight f8, knight on d takes b6, knight e6, queen e5, and black resigned. This is just basically game over. Now, that is sort of one of my STEM games for how to handle the knight f1 line. And to be fair, I mean, there's a lot of different games in modern practice that go down slightly different routes than this. And a lot of these games follow a lot of the same patterns up until this move even. A lot of games will go like, a lot of modern games are going a4, for example, bishop g7, bishop d3, follows the game Carlsen versus Barmides, played back in 2015, where Carlsen ended up winning with the white pieces. So, again, for whatever reason, people aren't 100% following Fischer's move of bishop g5, bishop d2. But I will also note that for whatever reason, everybody always plays a Marshall every single game, and everybody always plays a Berlin every single game. So the chances that you'll even get to play the position from Fischer versus Spassky in 1992 in modern chess are pretty slim. But if you do, those are kind of your options. You have this opportunity to play one of these two lines. After g6, you can play the immediate a4, or you can play my personal favorite and recommendation, bishop g5. And both of these should probably yield more than you would get out of the mainline Marshall or the mainline Berlin. But anyways, that's sort of my video on the Breyer variation. I know I did not cover everything. I know that there's going to be other lines that I didn't cover, and I'm probably going to get a million comments. Why didn't you cover this? Why didn't you cover that? It's just completely impossible. This video is already going to be 17 minutes long, and I just barely covered the main lines of the Breyer, but it should give you sort of an idea and a feel for what the ideas are in the position and how you can play these positions as white. Something that you do need to keep in mind in all of the old main lines is that almost no matter what you do as white or as black, all these positions are just going to be slight edge white. White has a pawn duo in the middle of the board. White has a little bit more space on all three sides of the board, and white's just going to have to play the middle game really well, and the same is true for black. This is in the old days, this was just how you kind of judged your chess ability. It was how well you could play the Ruy Lopez middle game. So anyways, I hope you found this position. I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.